The planet Bison is a lush forestry planet. During the night its skies turned a deep purple color, and that's when civilization becomes alive. Every 100 years the inhabitants called the Saturns host a ceremony called the Festival of Beat Noir, and what they do is that one of their race links up to this hexagonal monument and psychically remove their deepest fears from their mind. One of the Saturns, Nimte, was helping to psychic link another one of her race called Tse, who was preparing to remove her memories of her failed marriage, and she looked at Nimte with a sigh of relief. Nimte said to her that she's doing the right thing and mentioned that the slightly unfortunate death of her husband gave her a confidence boost. Tse quietly smiled at this and proceeded to get ready. The sound of a horn was heard in the distance and Nimte knew was coming. Her brother Kosniv had returned from his 3-day hunt and brought back food supplies. He placed down a large wrinkled worm-type creature called a pos and presented it as food for the ceremony. Nimte looked at it with disgust and said to him that the pos are an endangered species. Kosniv scoffed at this and walked off, feeling disinterested about his sister's comments. She sat down and looked at the dead pos. She then thought to herself, all her brother does is kill innocent and unintelligent life for food, for survival. The Saturns can live off what plant life is available and not resort to cannibalism. Kosniv meanwhile was sharpening some bladed weapons in his hut and was thinking how to be the main priestess of Beat Noir. One of these days he'll take her place and become a respectful leader in his own right. The TARDIS lands just on the outskirts of the village and the doctor steps out. Louisa followed out and says the planet reminds her of the 1956 movie Forbidden Planet. The doctor looked around. He says dusk is setting and told her to follow him to the village. When they walked in, some of the Saturns causally approached them and asked what their presence is for. He said to them he's here for the Festival of Beat Noir, and the Saturns backed down to let them in. Louisa asked what does this Festival of Beat Noir do? The doctor says it's a ceremony to remove fears from the mind using a hexagonal portal, describing it simply to her like it's a psychic rubbish bin, and she just gave a little okay response to it. A couple of Saturns were playing some percussion, tapping wooden drums with their hands and chanting something in their language. The two passed a table and Louisa saw what this planet's buffet had to offer while the doctor headed off nearby. The doctor walked up to the hexagonal monument and looked at in awe. Still here after many years. Then a voice came behind. He turned around and it was Nimte. She asked him what he was doing and the doctor then recognized her. She was confused and he said to her that he's the doctor. She didn't get it. She said to him the last she saw the doctor he was a blonde-haired cricketer with a piece of celery on his lapel, and then the doctor laughed. She was puzzled by the response and then he said to her he's a Time Lord. She then got it and realized that the doctor had changed his appearance. She then asked him if Nissa was with him. Louisa strolled up and Nimte greeted her. She said to Louisa that she's changed a bit with the blonde hair and clothes. Louisa was baffled by this and then Nimte mentioned her name was Nissa. Louisa said her name wasn't Nissa and then looked sternly at the doctor. Nimte then said to him that she'll better get the rest of the preparations ready. Louisa came to him and said, who's this Nissa person? He said to her she's an old traveling companion from the planet Traken, and Louisa just nodded her head. Later on at the dining table, Nimte spoke to the doctor about why did he return to Bison, and he said some quick thought popped into his head, triggering his last encounter on the planet. He then asked about her brother Kosniv. Her expression changed to a disrespectful look and said he tends to hunt a lot. He said it's a shame, and when he and Louisa arrived into the village there were a bunch of Staples stabbed to the trees with a pick. Nimte groaned in a disgusted manner and said he'll ruin this planet if he continues killing the little species. The doctor pondered at this revelation and said in a mumbly tone that it's part of her species evolution. Nimte then retorted in a scoldfully tone, bashed her fist onto the table and said that her race are peaceful who wouldn't hunt even for their own survival. What her brother thinks is that the planet is failing and living off all resources is the way to go. But also their ways of life did hinder their sibling relationship. She's the high priestess of Beat Noir and he's a measly peasant who messed with the wrong people. Just then Kosniv approached the table. He went over to Nimte and grunted to her if she liked the food he brought to the banquet. She disagreed to this question and said it was disposed of. Kosniv quietly resented this and then turned to the doctor. He said to him that he got rid of that decorative vegetable and that he's changed face. The doctor uttered a few words when he replied, but he was more distracted by a beady necklace with sliced ears and pulled teeth that looked like they belonged to humans. Kosniv looked down at his necklace and let out a deceitful grin. He said to him that humans visited the planet, rummaging through their homes and privacy. The doctor knew what he did and then Kosnev shoved the necklace to his face. He taunted the doctor saying about humans, worthless beings made for food, and then his attention turned to Louisa. Kosnev ranted that the humans he slaughtered could be related to her distant cousin and great-grandchild. The doctor quickly stood up and grabbed Kosnev by the throat. Nimte tried to stop him when they were at the banqueting table. The doctor growly said to Kosnev to not threaten his companion, and then Kosnev pushfully forced his way off without saying a word. Nimte apologized to Louisa for brother's actions. Louisa, trying to settle the mood, asked about the hexagonal monument and about this festival of beaten noir. Nimte tells her that the monument had been on the planet for millennia, even when the Saturns began expanding, and the whole festival beaten noir. The monument has powers to remove fear from the mind, phobia, traumatic memories and burdens brewing inside. Louisa was fascinated by this, and the doctor said to her that when he arrived on the planet in his 5th incarnation that the monument was faulting. In order to repair it, he had to psychically remove a portion of his memories into it to keep it working. Most of his memories involving his childhood and of his home planet. Louisa sat back, nearly falling off the bench, was surprised and asked him what does he remember now. He mentions he was at the academy, that he was friends with the master, and that he stole the TARDIS with his granddaughter in tow whom he calls Susan. Louisa was astonished by the doctor's backstory and what he can remember, how 100 years of his life. Nimte led some praise to him for revitalizing the monument and that they are looking for a participant to proceed with the ceremony. Louisa then spoke up and said she'll participate in the ceremony. The doctor quickly turned her and his face became a shade of white. He tried to dissuade her not to do it. The process will be painful when she's hooked up and will damage her mind. Memories will be erased and that she'll be reduced to a brainless shell being cared by who knows in the universe. But Louisa stood up to him and said she wanted something in the back of her mind to be erased. This is the opportunity to do it, and decided she'll participate. The doctor became reticent but kept it to himself and went along with it very begrudgingly. The doctor, Louisa and Nimte approached the monument. Nimte placed 2 wires on both sides of Louisa's temple. Louisa had to keel down a few yards away from the monument, and the doctor looked on at this, hoping she doesn't die in the process. He kneeled down next to her and said she doesn't have to, this in a pleaded but quietly tone. She said to him that it's the way to remove what was lurking in her mind since she was teenager, and then the doctor then mentioned about her abortion when she was 16 that she told him back in Bournemouth. She gravely looked at him and said to him it's far more worse than he knows. The monument began to active. She then held his hand and said she'll be alright. The doctor just looked at her and she gently pushed him aside. Nimte began a little sermon and that the ceremony will begin. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a bursting horn sound erupted behind them and Kosnev returned with his entourage of hunters in tow. The hunters then start sabotaging the ceremony, wounding Nimte's maidens, and then they seized upon her. Kosnev emerged from the crowd and the doctor quickly intervened to stop this. Kosnev brought out a handmade blade and pointed at his face. He said to the doctor that he's always saving humanity and civilization. Kosnev then pushed himself towards him menacingly and threatened to stab the doctor. The doctor tried to reason with him but no prevail, and in return Kosnev pushes him into the monument's portal, sending the doctor spiraling into the unknown. He then removed the wires from Louisa's temple and forcefully grabbed her by the throat, nearly choking her in the process. He also pushed her into the monument's portal and sent her spiraling into the unknown. He turned to his sister with his handmade blade and said he'll be taking over if he has to kill her. Nimte looked in horror and realized that her own brother was going to kill her. Louisa woke up on something hard. It was a sidewalk and she got up to her feet. She ended up in her hometown of Davenport, Iowa, but something seemed off and then realized it's 1963. She can remember vaguely it, and at this time she mustn't been 5 years old. The world around her was strange. Everything seemed to be in a loop over and over again. A car was passing by and then reappeared again. Same driver and same radio jingle again and again. Some of the people were walking past and the same effect happening. Like a skip on a record on the turntable, and then knows that it's a snapshot memory of her childhood being replied every minute and then repeated over again. Suddenly a flash of light came into her eyes and she ended up in what seemed to be the local college. She was wearing a dress and then knew where she was. One of the annual beauty pageants, and it was that time she won it. The audience was clapping and some flashes from the cameras surrounded her view. She closed her and then the flash of light returned again. She then awoke in what seemed to be in a hospital room of sorts. She was wearing a hospital gown and she was sat on a metal chair with a leather seat. Her legs were spread out and she looked over. She saw a doctor putting latex gloves on and walked towards her. He said to her to wait one moment and left the room. Someone was holding her and she turned. Her blood turned cold and her hair stood on end. It was her father and she realized where she was. She was reliving the moment when she had her abortion when she was 16 and she let out a scream. Her father just looked at her and kept holding her hand but tightly. The flash of light came again and this time she ended up in a space of blackness. She got scared by this. She whispered to herself for the doctor to come and that she needed him the most. She trusts him and sees him as a father figure to her than her own. Then she felt a tap on her shoulder and she turned round. It was the doctor and she quickly hugged him for comfort. The doctor said he witnessed some of her life in flashes and that he saw the filming of the adult film she was involved in before the two met. She was only relieved that he was by her side and then asked him where they are. He said Kosnev pushed them in the monument's portal and that they're in some middle point. When she was hooked up to the monument, the psychic link to her mind started to replicate her memories from childhood and adulthood. These menageries were formed by her. She's the one that can stop it and return back to reality. Then a suited figure emerged out of the darkness and the doctor seemed to recognize him. He carefully walked towards him but she grabbed him by his jacket and told him to not to go near. He asked her why and then the suited man called out. Then the face became clearer. The doctor did recognize him and said he met him in Lanzarote in 1984. It was Howard Foster, an archaeologist who discovered an artifact from the planet Trion and was Perry's stepfather. Louisa turned to him. She didn't know about this and that he crossed paths with him. She felt betrayed. The doctor said he caught a signal from that artifact and his curiosity got the better of him. He then asked how she and Howard know each other. Howard then revealed that Louisa is his biological daughter and the doctor's reaction reached a tensely rate. Louisa plucked up courage and confronted him. She shouted at him that he raped her when she was participating in that pageant. Why? And then Howard bluntly admitted his intention. He was sexually frustrated with his marriage and wanted satisfaction. In his mindset he turned to his daughter because of her beauty and he became lustful in the background when she was finishing high school. He couldn't handle with keeping dark secrets and decided to leave his family. Later on he reconciled with a woman who recently became widowed and her name was Janine Brown. That name echoed into the doctor's ears and then knew it was Perry's mother that Howard married afterwards. Howard then confronted him and asked what happened to his stepdaughter. Louisa turned back to him asking if this Perry traveled with him and the doctor said his stepdaughter is married to a Krontan warrior king called Acarnus. Howard just sniffed at this and didn't believe this. He thinks the doctor was a liar. He probably killed her like he does the rest of his companions before and since. The doctor retorted this accusation and then Louisa stood her ground against her father. She shouted him at that she doesn't want him in her life after the damage he caused to her and her family. Howard started to become wavy in appearance and she then said he'll be banished into the depths of hell. One last thing she said to him was she hopes he dies in horrible circumstances. Howard's appearance then disappeared with only a scream left in its wake and the doctor walked next to her. She held his hand and then the light reappeared more brighter than usual. The doctor and Louisa returned to Bicedon. She held him tightly and tears were streaming from her eyes. He comforted her and reassured her that she'd done the best she can do, venting out her trauma and facing her deepest personal fears. A sound of heavy breathing was then heard nearby and the doctor sat up. He saw Nimta lying the ground slowly dying and quickly raced to her. He held her in arms and she said that Kosnev stabbed her. He asked where he is and she frailly pointed to a dead body on the banquet table. Kosnev had killed himself because of burden and the doctor just closed his eyes. She touched his face with her finger and stroked it. The doctor got a flashback when he was in San Francisco with Dana. From Nimte's point of view she saw glimpses of his fifth incarnation and then it faded to his current incarnation. She dies and the doctor picked her dead body up. He placed her on the banquet table near her brother and gave a little speech involving sibling rivalries but they're still the same bloodline and gave a little salute to both them out of respect. He returned to Louisa. She was in a out of their dazed state and picked her up to return back to the TARDIS. He felt very remorseful to her about what she'd been through those years ago and had a different outcome of Howard Foster. A sexually deceptive bastard who wormed his way to reach a certain goal and to get away with it. Hopefully he doesn't come across him again but that's time for you. You'll met your inner demons in one place or another. When Louisa awoke within the TARDIS, She drowsily headed towards the console where the doctor was at the controls and curiously asked him if he can teach her how to control the TARDIS. He gave a baffled look at this and said she'll better take some more time to rest. She reluctantly agreed this and headed off to one of the bedrooms. He looked on at her. He was definitely puzzled by this, but a part of him thinks it'll give her some independence as long they don't end up at Caliver again. He returned his attention to the console and still thought of the prospect.